I still remember the sound my truck made when I rolled into the driveway that Saturday afternoon, gravel crunching under the tires. The radio humming some old country song I wasn't really listening to anymore, because after 10 days on the road, all I wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and 20 quiet minutes sitting on my back porch watching the wind move through the oak trees. My place wasn't fancy, never tried to be. It sat on just over 2 acres at the edge of a neighborhood that loved rules almost as much as it loved perfectly striped lawns. Every Tuesday morning, the HOA tractors rolled through like clockwork, trimming every blade of grass to the exact same height. Every mailbox looked identical. Every flower bed seemed designed by the same committee. And then there was my backyard. Stone retaining walls my grandfather had built with his own hands. Old white oaks that had been standing longer than any of those houses. Wild patches of native flowers my wife used to love before she passed away. And beneath all of it, hidden under decades of healthy soil, a 6,000-gallon septic system my grandfather installed back in the late 60s. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. 50 years without a single problem. That's the kind of thing nobody notices until somebody decides to mess with it. I stepped out of the truck carrying my overnight bag, walked around toward the back patio, and stopped dead in my tracks. For a second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing because where there used to be grass, gravelin, and the familiar rise above the septic field, there was now a wide sheet of fresh black asphalt stretching almost wall to wall, still shining in the afternoon sun like someone had poured liquid tar across my backyard. I actually looked around to make sure I hadn't somehow pulled into the wrong property. Then I noticed the heavy roller tracks, construction cones stacked by the fence, and the unmistakable smell of fresh pavement. My stomach dropped. They hadn't paved near my septic system. They had paved directly over it. 6 inches of asphalt sitting on top of equipment that was never supposed to be sealed beneath solid pavement. Before I could even gather my thoughts, I heard heels clicking across the driveway. "Welcome home," a cheerful voice called out. I turned and saw a woman I'd only met twice before. The HOA compliance director. Her name wasn't Clara anymore. Around here, everyone knew her as Denise Parker. The woman who carried a clipboard the way some people carried a badge. Sunglasses, pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched over the pocket, and a smile that somehow managed to feel more insulting than friendly. She stopped a few feet away and handed me a folded letter before I could ask a single question. "Good news," she said. "We solved the drainage problem behind your property." I stared at her, then back at my backyard. "What drainage problem?" She shrugged. "The board determined the ground near the walking trail looked unstable. We authorized improvements to protect community property." I laughed because honestly I thought she had to be joking. "Denise, that's my land." She tilted her head just enough to let me know she'd rehearsed this conversation. "Actually, the appearance of your property was affecting the shared recreational corridor." "Appearance," I repeated. "You paved over my septic system." She gave the kind of smile people use when they've already decided they're smarter than you. If everything was permitted correctly, there shouldn't be an issue. Then she tapped the envelope in my hand. "Also, you'll want to read that. Your retaining wall and natural landscaping have been cited as unauthorized visual obstructions. The board expects compliance within 30 days. I watched her walk away without another word, and for the first time since moving there, I realized this had never been about drainage. Denise had complained more than once during HOA meetings that my property looked unfinished. She hated the old stone walls, hated the taller native grasses, hated that my backyard refused to look like every other cookie-cutter lawn in the neighborhood. She couldn't force me to install sod because my property sat outside most landscaping rules, so instead she found another excuse. I unfolded the violation notice. Read it once, then read it again. Every sentence somehow made less sense than the one before it. Unauthorized stabilization project, community safety enhancement, visual compliance recommendation. It was corporate nonsense dressed up to sound official. My hands were shaking, not because I was scared, but because I knew enough about septic systems to understand exactly how dangerous this could become. Asphalt traps heat. It prevents proper soil ventilation. It changes drainage. It puts pressure where pressure doesn't belong. Whoever approved this either had no idea what they were doing or simply didn't care. Most people would have marched straight to the HOA office screaming. 10 years earlier, maybe I would have done exactly that. But age has a funny way of teaching patience. And my grandfather used to tell me something I'll never forget. He'd grin whenever somebody underestimated him and say, "Son, never interrupt someone who's halfway through digging their own hole." Standing there with that violation notice in one hand and 6 inches of fresh asphalt covering 50 years of engineering in the other, I had a feeling Denise Parker had just picked up the biggest shovel she'd ever hold. If you'd like to see how one phone call turned this neighborhood victory into an environmental investigation that nobody saw coming, continue with part 2. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing that asphalt baking under the afternoon sun, pressing down on the septic system that had quietly served my family for over half a century without asking for a thing in return. The funny part was, Denise probably thought she'd already won. She figured I'd complain at the next HOA meeting, maybe hire a lawyer, spend months arguing over property lines while the board buried me under paperwork. She never imagined I'd completely ignore the HOA and start calling people who couldn't care less about neighborhood politics. Sunday morning, before I'd even poured my first cup of coffee, I called the county health department. The woman who answered sounded tired until I explained exactly what had happened. There was a long pause on the line before she asked me to repeat one sentence. "Did you say they paved directly over the septic tank?" "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. "Please don't touch anything. I'm emailing you the county code right now." Less than 2 minutes later, my inbox lit up. Highlighted in black and white was a regulation so clear even a child could understand it. Septic tanks and drain fields were never to be permanently covered by asphalt or concrete because the soil needed to breathe. Inspections had to remain possible, and trapped gases could create environmental and safety hazards. No exceptions. I thanked her, printed every page, and started making another list. Next came an environmental engineer I'd met years earlier while helping a friend rebuild after a flood. His name was Alan Brooks, one of those quiet guys who explained complicated things without ever making you feel stupid. I emailed him photos of the new pavement. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "Please tell me those pictures are fake." "I wish they were." He sighed so hard I could hear it through the speaker. "Your tank vents are probably sealed. If groundwater shifts or pressure builds the wrong way, you're looking at sewer gas, contaminated runoff, possible structural failure. Honestly, whoever approved this doesn't understand how septic systems work." "Could it become dangerous?" I asked. "Let's put it this way," he replied. "If I found this during an inspection, I'd shut the project down immediately." I wrote every word down. By lunchtime, I'd contacted zoning, environmental protection, soil conservation, and the state water quality office. I wasn't calling because I wanted revenge anymore. I was calling because every single expert kept sounding more concerned than the last. By Monday afternoon, my dining room table looked like a detective's office. Printed regulations, survey maps, property deeds, drone photos from before the paving project, receipts proving the septic system had been inspected just 6 months earlier. I even dug through old family boxes until I found faded photographs of my grandfather installing portions of the original field back in the late 60s. Looking at those pictures hit me harder than I expected. There he was wearing work boots, covered in clay, smiling beside equipment that was built to last generations. He always believed if you took care of the land would take care of you. Somewhere along the way, neighborhoods had forgotten that. They started treating property like decoration instead of responsibility. Tuesday morning, my neighbor Carl wandered over carrying 2 coffees. He'd lived across the walking trail for nearly 15 years and usually stayed out of HOA drama. He looked toward the black asphalt, shook his head, and quietly asked, "You planning to sue?" I smiled. "No." He looked confused. "Then what?" "I'm just letting the right people do their jobs." He laughed. "That's either brilliant or terrifying. Hopefully both." Before leaving, he admitted something interesting. Denise had pushed the paving project through without waiting for the full board vote. She claimed it qualified as an emergency maintenance repair because the walking trail might eventually settle near my property. Might eventually. That phrase kept bouncing around in my head. They hadn't responded to an emergency. They'd invented one. By Wednesday, I had everything organized into a digital folder with labeled sections so clean even a prosecutor would have appreciated it. Photos with timestamps, survey, overlays, copies of county regulations, recorded phone calls where officials explained why covering septic infrastructure violated environmental codes, inspection history, property boundaries. The complaint itself ended up almost 40 pages long by the time I finished attaching supporting documents. When I finally pressed the submit button, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt strangely calm. My part was over. The system would either work or it wouldn't. Early Thursday morning, I was sitting on the porch feeding peanuts to the squirrels when 3 white pickup trucks slowly rolled into my driveway. None of them carried county logos. Just plain government vehicles with small license plates. 4 men and 2 women climbed out wearing reflective vests and carrying measuring equipment instead of briefcases. One introduced himself from environmental health. Another worked for soil conservation. The third represented building safety. They all already had copies of my complaint in their hands. "Mr. Walker," one of them asked, "would you mind showing us exactly where the paving occurred?" I nodded and led them into the backyard. They spread out immediately, measuring elevations, photographing every angle, checking utility maps, comparing property records against construction boundaries. One inspector used a metal locator to identify the septic tank beneath the asphalt. Another crouched beside a crushed vent pipe sticking just above the pavement. "Well," he muttered quietly to nobody in particular, "that's not supposed to look like that." About 20 minutes into the inspection, I noticed movement across the walking trail. Denise stepped outside her house carrying that same familiar clipboard, probably expecting another ordinary workday. Then she noticed 6 inspectors standing in my backyard. She froze halfway down her front steps. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence draining out of her face. She marched over, trying to sound authoritative. "Excuse me, may I ask what's happening here?" The lead inspector didn't even glance up from his notes. "Official county investigation." Denise smiled nervously. There must be some misunderstanding. This was a community improvement project. He finally looked at her. "Did your association obtain permits for excavation or paving above regulated septic infrastructure?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. "We believed permits weren't necessary." He closed his notebook. "Belief isn't a permit." I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Denise tried another angle. "The homeowner never objected. I couldn't help myself. I was in Missouri when your contractors paved my backyard." One inspector looked back and forth between us before asking Denise a simple question. "Did you notify the property owner before construction began?" Silence. Absolute silence. The only sound came from a breeze moving through the oak branches overhead. The inspector made one more note on his clipboard. Another official called everyone over after locating blocked drainage routes leading toward the neighborhood walking trail. Water that should have filtered naturally through soil now had nowhere to go. If the system failed, contaminated runoff could eventually reach shared community property. Suddenly, this wasn't only about my backyard anymore. It involved public health. Denise's shoulders slowly dropped as reality caught up with her. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked less like the woman who controlled the neighborhood, and more like someone realizing she'd just opened a door she could never close again. The inspectors stayed until nearly sunset, documenting every inch of the project while contractors' measurements, engineering standards, environmental regulations, and county codes piled higher and higher against the HOA. I stood quietly beside my grandfather's old stone wall watching it all unfold, thinking about something he'd told me decades ago. "People can ignore common sense for a long time," he'd say, "but eventually they run into facts. And facts don't negotiate." As the last inspector packed away his equipment, he looked over his shoulder and said, "Mr. Walker, I think you'll be hearing from us very soon." Judging by the look on Denise's face, I had a feeling the HOA would hear from them first. If you're ready for the final chapter, where the inspection results triggered resignations, massive fines, and one ending that split the entire neighborhood right down the middle, continue with Part 3. The official report arrived the following Monday morning, delivered by certified mail in an envelope thick enough that I already knew it wasn't bringing good news for someone. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen table, poured myself another cup of coffee, and opened it slowly. 48 pages. Every single one somehow worse than the last if you happen to be sitting on the HOA board. The inspectors documented unauthorized construction, damage to regulated septic infrastructure, crushed ventilation components, improper surface sealing, altered drainage patterns, environmental compliance failures, and multiple permit violations that should never have made it past the planning stage. Buried near the end was the number everyone in the neighborhood would eventually memorize: $87,000 in civil penalties before repairs even began. I leaned back in my chair and laughed, not because I enjoyed seeing people lose money, but because the entire disaster had started over something Denise insisted was simply making my backyard look better. Turns out appearances can be expensive. The neighborhood exploded before lunchtime. Someone leaked part of the inspection report into the community Facebook group, and within an hour, homeowners were demanding emergency meetings, financial statements, and explanations for why reserve funds might now disappear fixing a problem nobody had approved. By Tuesday evening, the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. I almost didn't attend, but Carl convinced me. "You ought to hear this one in person," he said with a grin. The atmosphere inside felt completely different from every HOA meeting I'd ever attended. Denise wasn't standing confidently beside the projector anymore. She sat quietly at the end of the table, avoiding eye contact while board members argued among themselves. The HOA president, Richard Collins, looked like he hadn't slept in days. Halfway through the meeting, someone stood up in the back and asked the question everyone had been whispering about: who authorized paving private property without permits? Nobody answered. Then another homeowner raised her hand. "Are our dues paying for this?" Still nothing. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "The board relied on recommendations made by our compliance office." Every head in the room slowly turned toward Denise. She tried defending herself. "I acted in what I believed was the community's best interest." An older gentleman near the front immediately replied, "No. You acted because you couldn't stand looking at his backyard." The room fell silent. Nobody argued with him because deep down almost everyone knew it was true. 3 days later, Richard resigned. Denise was placed on administrative leave while the HOA's insurance company launched its own investigation. Then came another surprise nobody expected. Their insurance carrier refused to immediately cover the claim because preliminary findings suggested the damage resulted from unauthorized decisions rather than an unforeseen accident. Suddenly, lawyers weren't just arguing with the county. They were arguing with their own insurance company, too. 2 weeks after the inspection, heavy equipment rolled back into my yard. This time, nobody was smiling for photographs. The same kind of machines that had laid fresh asphalt now carefully peeled it away, one section at a time, while environmental supervisors watched every move. I spent most of that morning sitting on my porch in the same old wooden chair my grandfather used to claim whenever he wanted to watch the sunset. Every bucket of broken pavement lifted away revealed more of the earth beneath it, almost like the land itself had been waiting patiently to breathe again. One of the contractors eventually walked over during lunch. "Sir," he said quietly, "I wasn't on the original paving crew, but if I'd known there was a septic system under there, I would have refused the job." I nodded. "I believe you." He looked embarrassed anyway. Sometimes good people end up cleaning messes they never created. When the last piece of asphalt disappeared, inspectors completed another evaluation confirming the tank itself had survived with only minor repair work thanks to its original reinforced construction. I couldn't help smiling. My grandfather built things the old-fashioned way, stronger than they needed to be because he believed someone else would depend on them one day. He was right. A month later, the grass had already started growing back across the repaired soil. Wildflowers returned on their own without anyone planting them. The walking trail looked exactly the same as it always had, except now people slowed down whenever they passed my backyard. Some waved. Some apologized for believing the rumors. A few admitted they'd been afraid to speak up because nobody wanted to become the HOA's next target. That's probably the saddest part of the whole story. It wasn't really about asphalt. It wasn't even about a septic system. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop questioning authority simply because that authority carries a clipboard instead of common sense. Even now, every once in a while, somebody asks whether I regret reporting the HOA instead of quietly working things out behind closed doors. My answer never changes. If Denise had knocked on my front door before touching my property, we'd probably have shared a cup of coffee and solved the entire issue in 20 minutes. Instead, she decided power mattered more than respect, and once government inspectors became involved, nature and the law simply followed the evidence wherever it led. I don't think I beat the HOA. I think the HOA defeated itself the moment it forgot that owning a title doesn't give anyone ownership over someone else's land. And here's the question I've been wondering ever since. If you had come home and found strangers paving over part of your property because they claimed it was for the good of the neighborhood, would you have handled it differently? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let the facts speak louder than the arguments? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbors, or people who confused authority with accountability. I genuinely love to hear where you think the line should be drawn between community rules and private property rights.